You were not randomly drawn to this moment. That's not a dramatic claim. It's simply an observation. At any given time, there are millions of videos competing for your attention. You didn't see most of them. You didn't pause on them. You didn't stay. But here you are, still listening. That alone is worth noticing. Not because it makes you special, not because it means anything extraordinary about you, but because attention itself is never random. This channel exists in a quiet space. It doesn't demand, it doesn't rush. It doesn't ask you to believe anything. And yet, you're here. That's the first thing to observe. You don't need to do anything with that fact. Just notice it. Most of your day is spent responding to notifications, to expectations, to noise. Very little of it is spent observing the process itself. The moment you slow down enough to notice what you're noticing, something subtle happens. Not a transformation, not a breakthrough, just a shift in perspective. And perspective is where understanding begins. This video isn't here to convince you of anything. It isn't here to reveal a hidden truth or give you a system to follow. It's here to explore something simple, but often overlooked: the relationship between awareness, frequency, and observation. These are not mystical terms, they're descriptive ones. Frequency, in its most basic sense, is repetition over time, a signal repeating, a pattern recurring, a thought returning. Awareness is your ability to notice those repetitions without immediately reacting to them. Observation is what happens when awareness is steady enough to stay present. You already do this more than you realize. Think about how often you sense something before you can explain it. Not a prediction, not intuition in a dramatic sense. Just a quiet recognition. A pattern you've seen before, a tone you've heard before, a situation that feels familiar even if the details are different. That recognition doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from accumulated observation. Your brain is constantly filtering information. Most of it never reaches conscious awareness. If it did, you'd be overwhelmed. So instead, you experience a refined version of reality, one shaped by what you've paid attention to in the past. This is where frequency matters. The more often something enters your awareness, the easier it becomes to notice it again. Not because it appears more, but because you've trained yourself to recognize it. Like learning a new word and suddenly seeing it everywhere. The word didn't increase in frequency. Your awareness of it did. This applies to ideas, to behaviors, to emotional patterns, to content. At some point, something aligned closely enough with your existing awareness that you paused. That pause is meaningful, not in a symbolic way, but in a practical one. It reveals something about how your attention is currently tuned, not elevated, not awakened, tuned. And tuning doesn't imply progress or superiority. It implies adjustment, constant, neutral, ongoing. There's a common misunderstanding that being observed means being judged or controlled. In most contexts, observation is passive. It doesn't interfere. It doesn't correct. It simply records. You observe yourself constantly. You notice your own thoughts. You catch yourself reacting. You recognize habits forming and dissolving. That internal observer is always present even when ignored. What's interesting is how rarely we talk about this without exaggeration. Observation doesn't grant power, it grants clarity. And clarity doesn't demand action. It just makes action optional instead of automatic. When you watch something like this, part of you is content-focused, but another part is context-aware. You're not just hearing words. You're sensing tone, pacing, intention. You're deciding whether this space feels safe enough to stay in. That decision happens quickly, but not randomly. Trust builds when nothing is demanded from you. If you've ever found yourself staying with a video longer than expected, not because it was exciting, but because it was steady, you've experienced this effect. Your nervous system recognized a lack of urgency. Your attention wasn't being pulled forward. It was allowed to rest. That's rare. Most content is designed to spike, to provoke, to escalate. This kind of environment does the opposite. It lowers amplitude, it reduces contrast, and in doing so, it reveals patterns that high stimulation tends to obscure. When stimulation drops, observation increases. This is why certain ideas only surface in quiet moments. Not because they're hidden, but because they require space. You might notice that nothing in this video is asking you to change your life. There's no promise at the end, no destination implied. That's intentional, because understanding doesn't arrive as a conclusion. It accumulates as familiarity. You become familiar with your own reactions, familiar with how attention moves, familiar with what feels coherent and what feels forced. Over time, you start to recognize when something is being pushed at you versus offered to you. That recognition is a form of awareness. And awareness changes how frequency affects you. You're still exposed to the same information as everyone else. The same headlines, the same narratives, the same cycles. But you relate to them differently. You notice repetition sooner. You notice framing. You notice what's missing. Not in a suspicious way, in a neutral one. You begin to see that most things are patterns repeating with slight variation. Arguments, trends, emotional hooks, even identities. Once you see a pattern clearly, it loses its urgency. Not because it stops existing, but because it stops prizing you. Surprise is what captures attention. Familiarity is what sustains it. That's an important distinction. This channel isn't built around surprise. It's built around sustained attention. The kind that doesn't exhaust you. The kind that allows you to think alongside the content instead of chasing it. You're still here. It suggests that this pace matches something in you right now. Not permanently, not essentially, just currently. And that can change. Observation isn't about locking into a frequency. It's about noticing when frequencies shift. You've likely experienced moments where your interests changed without a clear reason. What once felt engaging started to feel loud. What once felt boring started to feel relevant. Those transitions aren't random. They reflect internal adjustments. You don't choose them directly. You notice them after they've happened. That noticing is the observer. It doesn't direct the process. It witnesses it. And witnessing, when done calmly, builds trust. With content, with ideas, and with yourself. There's no conclusion to reach here. No final insight that wraps everything together. If anything, the more you observe, the less final things feel. Understanding becomes layered instead of linear. You don't arrive. You remain. That's why it makes sense to leave some things open-ended. To not explain everything. To allow questions to stay unresolved. Resolution isn't always productive. Sometimes it closes attention too quickly. An open loop doesn't pull you forward. It keeps the space breathable. So if you find yourself returning to content like this, not obsessively, not urgently, just occasionally, when your attention feels quieter, that's enough. You don't need to label it. And if you choose to stay connected to this channel, to let it exist in your periphery rather than your focus, that's exactly how it's meant to be used. No pressure, no expectation, Observer frequency isn't here to lead you anywhere. It's here to notice with you. And that's all that's required.